den Rechten.
Bir müşteri olan
Den rechten Teil an der Nordseite.
Moving forward.
So we could begin with the idea that automobility, that is the movement made possible by motor vehicles, is a double-edged sword. And we take this idea from Anthony Giddens, who has said this of modernity, that modernity is a double-edged sword in that it gives us a number of opportunities and wealth and opportunities for flourishing that we wouldn't otherwise have. But at the same time, it wreaks a degree of havoc on both human health and the health of the non-human world. And in the United States, this is a particularly sharp problem. The blades of the edges of this sword are particularly sharp. In the United States, the role of the automobile plays such a fundamental, it's so central to daily life and to national identity. And so the question becomes is, how do we reconcile these two aspects of this contradiction of automobility? How do we reconcile the violence that it does to the world with the opportunities and the freedoms and the flourishing that it makes possible? And so how in the United States can we imagine a future where the automobile has a different role in our daily lives? So we begin with the theoretical premise that one fundamental way that people make sense of problems or make sense of contradictions is by thinking in terms of the future, thinking temporally. And Emir Bayer and Mish have written about this temporal aspect of human agency in terms of the projective dimension of human agency. And so that is to say that when we act in the present, we act not only with knowledge of our past and situated in the present, but we think in terms of what we can become in the future. This means thinking that things will be possible that aren't possible now. This means envisioning potential change within ourselves. And so I would suggest that thinking the future, that is to say, social imagination, is an act not just of projection or imagination, but of fundamentally reconsidering who we are as a society, as a culture. One form that this takes is to envision what ruptures are possible or likely or desirable, what changes we might hope for, what changes we might anticipate. And at the same time, this also means envisioning what continuities in our identity we expect to continue. What continuities will allow us to continue to be who we are. One example that can illustrate this point is actually a cover of the Popular Mechanics magazine from 1951, which shows a helicopter in the garage of a suburban household. And so we can see that here the Popular Mechanics magazine has envisioned a potential change in the form of us all driving helicopters to work instead of cars, but at the same time it reinforces a very particular sense of American identity in that you can see the architecture of the house and the lawn and the man's hat and the fact that it's a man putting the helicopter back in the garage reinforces a sense of very particular suburban identity, very autonomously mobile suburban identity. And so the question that that one can ask is, how does this renegotiation of identity happen today when we face issues of climate change and the depletion of resources? There are three approaches today to the future of automobility in the US. And they can be characterized as accelerate, rebuild, and transition. And the first one, accelerate, sees the need to accelerate the process of technological innovation in order to better deal with the issues of climate change and resource depletion. The second one sees the need to rebuild our cities along the lines of American cities before the post-war suburban expansion. And the third approach, transition, it sees the need to fundamentally transition to a thoroughly different way of life in the context of a dramatically different economy post-peak oil and as we experience the effects of climate change. In 2001, the U.S. Department of Energy launched an initiative. It published a report that it entitled the Quadrennial Technology Review, or the QDR. And it modeled this review after the Quadrennial Defense Review, which is a report that the Defense Department puts out every 4 years to establish trends and try to put forward a program for action for defense policy. And so the Energy Department put together a similar program to address energy transformations in the years to come. And so what one can see when one looks at this broad project of energy transformation is we see a vision where changes in transportation form a large part of a broader transformation of the energy landscape. But what we also see is that transportation here is not seen as a social issue per se. It's seen more as a technological issue. The vision of the future that you see in the Quadrennial Technology Review and all of the documents associated with it is one where innovation accelerates. It accelerates into the future, and this is what will solve the problem of climate change and resource depletion. And if not solve it completely, at least make it manageable well into the future. And the idea here is that historically it's taken decades for technological innovation to unfold. But given enough resources, given enough research, given enough engineers, given enough labs working on the problem, given enough grad students with enough grants, then we will be able to accelerate this process and shorten the timeline from several decades to 1 or 2 decades. And this is what will allow us to bring down carbon dioxide emissions in a timely manner. What we also see in these texts is a vision of the American identity that remains based fundamentally around the car. It remains a consumer. The American remains a driver. And the American remains fundamentally an individual, autonomously mobile American. It also gives the sense of the nation state as the locus of problem solving, that here we see it's engineers that fundamentally change mobility. The change happens in labs, not in homes. The change happens in test tracks, not in driveways, not in people's lifestyles. And indeed, the underlying concept is that these are the only places that meaningful change can happen because the American consumer won't change, and we shouldn't expect them to change. And so it makes sense then for this transformation to come primarily from the technological end. The second approach, which we can characterize as rebuild, envisions the future primarily in terms of the past. And what I mean by this is that there's a very strong sense among the new urbanist movement in the United States and the related smart growth movement and similar approaches to urban planning that see the 20th century as a moment of rupture, particularly the expansion of the suburbs and the increasing rates of motorization represented to them a moment of abandonment of the cities and a moment of social isolation and fundamentally a sort of ripping out of the fabric of American social life and a wrong turn from the more, to them, more natural, organic way of living in community, which is to say in small neighborhoods. For this approach, we can look to the Department of Transportation and the Environmental Protection Agency and even the Department for Housing and Urban Development, who formed a partnership for sustainable communities that is working to develop standards for smart growth, that is to say, ways that urban areas can reshape their urban spaces that are more conducive to mobility that does not depend on the car. One aspect of this rebuilding of the cities is the mistrust of the urban sprawl that occurred in the post-war era in the US. And it's an effort to conserve the spaces that managed to make it past that moment of destruction and this moment of the rupture in the social fabric. So that means rebuilding dense mixed-use neighborhoods. That means preserving historic buildings. And that means actively creating continuity in the built and natural environment. And in terms of American identity, this is relatively radical because what it asserts is that the fundamental American identity is not this autonomously mobile individual subject that we've come to believe it is, but in fact that the real America is the America of the town, of the city, of the neighborhood. And so in this sense, to rebuild cities is not to abandon this American identity, but rather to reaffirm it, to reassert it as it had been before urban sprawl. What we also see is the idea of design as governance. And so the idea here is that if you design your cities well enough, you can produce social outcomes that are desirable. And this is where climate change and resource depletion comes in, which is that if we design urban spaces well enough, then not only can we restore this American identity that we've lost in the 20th century, but in doing so, we can reduce our oil consumption and our carbon dioxide emissions. The third approach to the future of mobility in the US can be characterized as the transition approach. And this approach is fairly radically different than the other two in that it sees as inevitable a moment of crisis where climate change and resource depletion will reach a point that life as we know it will change dramatically whether we want to or whether we want it to or not. The economies will change because we can't rely on cheap fuels, and so transportation will become more difficult and economies will change, and this will affect the way that we live our lives. In the US, the transition approach is mostly grassroots movement still. There are a few cities that have sort of adopted some of its ideas, but mainly it remains a fairly ad hoc, although growing, movement. And for this, we can look to the Post-Carbon Institute based in California, and also the growing transition movement, which started in the UK in the early 2000s, but is now growing across the US. The basic premise is that we're facing an energy descent, and that the human population has reached a moment of overshoot. And overshoot is an idea that comes from ecological theory, that populations go through cycles, and the human population is currently headed for a moment in a cycle of collapse. The idea of energy descent is very important in this concept. And if you look at one of the iconic images from the transition movement's literature, you can see how as we descend, on the one hand, we become less energy intensive, but on the other hand, we find new ways of being in the world that are potentially more fulfilling. And so it's a combination of deep pessimism as we face the idea of collapse of society as we know it, and major crises, major ruptures, but we also can potentially embrace this as an opportunity to change and to grow in better ways. Another image that illustrates this comes from the Transition US Primer, and you can see here it says, bringing a new world to life, and coming from the black and white world to a world in color. And so the idea here is that we do face a radical change, and an inevitable radical change, and that the only continuity that we can be assured of in such an uncertain future is any continuity that we build ourselves. And so this is why the concept of resilience is so important to this approach, is that resilience is the ability to build continuity yourself, to recover from crisis, to recover from ruptures. In terms of American identity, this takes some interesting forms. The idea of adventure is actually very important to this approach. The idea that we are headed into unknown territory, and so we have strengths that we don't know that we possess, but that we will find and develop along the way. I've even heard it said that in this context, we're all going to become pioneers again. And so this, of course, draws on a rich American tradition of frontiersmanship and bravery in the face of the unknown. And so here, it's a very different kind of idea of what the future holds. It's not that we are going to accelerate technological innovation in order to solve problems. It's not that we're going to rebuild our cities to recapture something that's lost. It's that we're headed for the great unknown, but that we have the resources within us to face this great unknown. To wrap up, it's worth noting that there are, in fact, several convergences between the different approaches. They share a lot of things. You know, the policies enacted by the smart growth movement are very similar to policies desired by the transition movement, and even the Department of Energy recognizes the importance of things like land densification and public transportation. And so there are several policies that all approaches can agree on. However, what remains interesting, what remains, I think, fundamentally more important is the dramatically different understandings that these different approaches take to what the future holds, what road we're on. One Department of Energy technology roadmap states that the path to success is clearer now than ever before. So in this vision, we're on a path, we know the way, all we have to do is accelerate down that path. The second approach sees us as having taken the wrong turn, that we're going in the wrong direction, and that we've already tried striking out in a new direction in the 20th century, and that it didn't work. And we abandoned the ways of human settlement and living in neighborhood that we have known for centuries work. And so what we have to do is to turn around and to go back to the way that we know is a good way to live. And finally, the transition approach sees the path that we're on as ending, whether we want it to or not. And once it ends, we have no idea what our path will be or what our destination will look like. This image here is from the Transition US primer to action on climate change and peak oil, and it's very telling that the destination sign is empty. And what this means for social action is that we have the opportunity now that we've never had in quite the same way before to have a conversation about what that destination can look like. So there is definitely potential for political coalition building, for overlap between the different approaches. And I think it would be a mistake to attempt to pick one or the other as the right one. They all have their important contributions to make. So overall, despite the similarities between the approaches, the question of where we're headed in the US, of what our mobility in the future will look like in an era of climate change and resource depletion, remains fundamentally unsettled.
Seite sowie den Außenbereich den Rechten.